Well, we have seen a small agreement, or at least a draft agreement, be published just this morning. 7 pages of agreement that calls on more drastic action to be taken before the end of next year. But to what extent is this COP a success? What is the sign of the Prime Minister hurtling back today? Does that look like a man who is comfortable with with how things are going here in Glasgow? And in what is the position of this Prime Minister? How comfortable is he with the whole political context this week? Well, one person who has been studying the runes, the numbers, and how Britain actually thinks about this all is Joe Twyman, who is, of course, co-founder and director of Delta Poll. Welcome to the programme, Joe. First of all, the Tories have had a bit of a hit this week. What's the lay of the land across all the different pollsters? Where do things stand at the moment?
Well, the most recent polls have the Conservatives with a small lead, usually between 1 and 3 points, and that's something that's emerged since the weekend. But that in itself is the continuation of a longer trend that we've seen really going back the last few months. And it's worth remembering, of course, that this time last year, around half the polls had Labour in front. And so we have seen quite a roller coaster, admittedly a shallow roller coaster, but a roller coaster nonetheless over the last year. And the key question now going into Christmas is where will this go? Will this trend continue? Will Labour be able to sneak ahead, or will the Conservatives be able to hold on?
At this point in the middle of a parliament and have the governing party still ahead. I'm sure many people will remember Ed Miliband's double-digit leads ahead of David Cameron, even William Hague at some points being ahead of Tony Blair, Michael Foot being ahead of Margaret Thatcher. To what extent is the Labour Party in trouble?
Well, all of those people that you mentioned never had to spend the first year and a half of their time in opposition fighting a COVID pandemic, and the unique circumstances of the coronavirus situation has meant that politics is simply all up for grabs, and the usual rules simply do not apply. If you go back to William Hague's time, for instance, then yes, the petrol crisis in early 2000 did indeed bring about a short change in fortunes, but it was only very short. And the rest of the time, it was pretty certain that Labour would hold on. That was an example of a talking point, and there have been plenty of talking points along the way as we travel through this Parliament. But there hasn't been much in the way of turning points, and the reason for that is that up until now, at least, certainly up until the last couple of weeks, all attention has been concentrating on short-term health implications and dealing with the pandemic, and how the government is perceived to be doing in dealing with the coronavirus situation has correlated very closely with their performance at the polls. And so, as I said, at this time last year, half the polls showed Labour ahead, and that was because the trajectory was downwards in terms of government performance when it came to coronavirus. If you remember, there were calls for Christmas to be cancelled and all sorts of difficult situations with rising numbers around the Delta variant. But since then, particularly since the introduction of the vaccine system and the rollout of a successful vaccine programme, we've seen the government's fortunes rise. And although they're not in the situation of a double-digit lead that they were in back in May, they are still ahead. But, of course, now that people's attention begins to return to other things, returns to normal, of course, and the Labour Party get the opportunity to put some of their thoughts and policies across in a way they really haven't been able to do in the last 18 months, that will really be the first proper test for the government. And the question remains whether they will survive as the cumulative effect of the type of incidents that we've seen this week starts to take its toll.
No, it is fascinating listening to those talking points that we've had over the last year, whether it was the fuel crisis that we've experienced, whether it was various other issues, the early accusations of sleaze and corruption, of handing out contracts to friends. That didn't seem to really hit. Is it your contention, perhaps, that most of the country now feels that the pandemic is behind us? Cases are declining, have been impressively declining happening without restrictions. It sort of feels like we've entered this more endemic rather than pandemic stage, and sort of that pandemic now being hopefully behind us means that the normal rules of politics start to apply.
Well, a large majority of people are still concerned about the virus, and a sizable proportion say they're very concerned. And so I wouldn't say that it's behind us necessarily. And particularly, we don't know how things will develop on the science side of things. And so let's not hope that it happens. But a vaccine-resistant new strain, for instance, could explode and start to spread through the country. But assuming that doesn't happen, then I think certainly over the next few weeks and months, people will start to put the virus behind them and think about, if you like, the normal things that people consider during politics. And so that's everything from education to immigration, taxation to the economy. But in the run-up to Christmas, we will still be feeling the effects of the virus, particularly when it comes to, for instance, driver shortages and the effect on services. And the strain that it's placing on the NHS. And so the knock-on effects will still be with us for some months, perhaps even years to come.
I wonder how much the Tories will simply be able to see whenever they whenever they have a problem, oh, this was the pandemic, this was the virus, anyone would have this problem. It seems to be a bit of a get-out clause that may serve them well. One final question for you. I'm here in Glasgow. The Prime Minister is arriving later today. Are people paying attention to COP? Does anyone care?
Yes, people are paying attention. Some people do care, certainly. It's more likely that younger people are going to pay attention than older people, and they don't tend to be the grassroots of the Conservative Party. But I think, in a sense, it doesn't really matter what's happened over the last couple of weeks. As your previous guest mentioned, what will be really important is whether there's a big announcement at the end. If some sort of deal is struck, if there's a Glasgow treaty on climate change in the way that there was in Paris and Kyoto, we might well see people measure its impact in a very different way than if it just fizzles out with no agreement struck. And so, really, there's still ample opportunity for it to have a big impact on public opinion.
In the polls there. There could be a bounce in the polls there if an agreement is reached. That seems to be a very interesting point. I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there in this conversation. But Joe Twyman, thank you so much for joining us this morning.